for 20 years. It has a business, Bookworm Editing Services, which focuses on editing policies and procedures for information technology departments and formatting and editing formulary dossiers for pharmaceutical clients. As far as STC, she's an associate fellow, current president of the STC Rochester chapter, co-manager of the technical editing SIG, and you said you're also on the nominating committee?
Yeah, this will be my second year.
Okay, and she's spoken for us before. She's spoken at regional and national STC conferences, webinars like this, and also the American Medical Writers Association national conference. Okay, go ahead, Kelly.
Great, thanks, Laura. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad you guys have this virtual conference. I had a lot of conferences canceled in the spring, so it's nice to still be able to speak to my colleagues and, sometimes see people, chat with people that I know in some way, shape, or form. So thanks for attending my session. Today, my goal is to turn you all into checklist specialists, evangelists for the benefits of an old school hack, a paper checklist, and our computer-centric daily work lives. My comprehensive checklists, when used to their full potential, have the power to make you more efficient and consistent in your communication tasks. So I'm kind of going in a different direction from Jose, who did a great talk about Microsoft Word, which is more technology. I'm going to go kind of old school here. So as Laura said, I'm Kelly Schrank. I'm a member of AMWA, Bells. I'm an associate fellow of STC, been a technical writer and editor for over 20 years. And in the last 10 years, I've also been a medical editor in the pharmaceutical industry, working as an employee and now for myself. As an independent and freelance editor, my niche is editing formulary dossiers. I help clients with consistency, structure, clarity, as well as Word and PowerPoint. And I still pursue short-term tech writing contracts, usually writing SOPs or maybe working on cybersecurity policies and procedures. Couple of the things that I've done lately. So I've been an advocate for the use of comprehensive checklists and communication tasks for 8 or 9 years. It all started when I was given a bad checklist at a job by people who weren't editors and didn't understand what I was doing as a medical editor. It wasn't specific enough. It really wasn't helpful to me. I started making the initial checklist I was given better over time. It grew into different checklists, with each one being specific to a task. And then it kind of grew into a little pet project, a topic that I like to speak about at a lot of conferences. I've used them myself. I had a team at one point. We were using checklists together. So this is just kind of one of the things that I like to talk about with other people. As you can see, I presented a variety of sessions on this topic online and at conferences for many years. I'm also preparing a workshop for the Association of Independent Information Professionals, or I always say that wrong, AIIP. I was supposed to give it at their conference, one of the many conferences that was canceled, which was supposed to be next week, but since it was canceled, I'm now preparing to present it virtually. The tentative date is June 2nd, so if you want to follow me on LinkedIn, you might hear more information on that session if you want to dive deeper into this topic with me. You could say I'm passionate about the topic. I get a little excited when I start talking about how much checklists can help writers and editors and business owners be more efficient and consistent in their work. So let's get started by looking at what we're going to cover today. I'll provide an introduction into the topic of using comprehensive checklists in work situations and how I use them in my own work. I'll walk you through how to create a good comprehensive checklist according to me for the way I use them to be more efficient and consistent in my communication tasks. I'll answer the question, how do you know you have good checklists? I'll provide some highlights of what we talked about. I'll provide a list of resources I used for some of the background in the session. And then I welcome questions about how you can become a checklist specialist, or I'd love to hear your testimonials about the joys and life-changing properties of checklists for for those who already consider themselves checklist specialists, even if they didn't know and didn't give themselves that title before. I'll finish by sharing my contact information if you want more information or want to stay in touch. If you want to share your checklists, I love seeing other people's checklists. So just to offer this disclaimer, I do know that lots of people like checklists. People have to-do lists for daily tasks. They have packing lists for travel. They use grocery lists. But Atal Gawande, a well-known staff writer for The New Yorker and author of many bestsellers, wrote a whole book on checklists, how people use them in a variety of industries to save lives, fly planes, manage large-scale construction projects. It covers checklists as people use them in the workplace, which is what I'll be talking about. And lucky you, my discussion will be specific to tasks that you're likely to do as technical communicators. I highly recommend this book. It's a fun read, very engaging, with a running story about how the use of checklists saves lives in operating rooms, and many interesting ventures into research about how other industries use checklists. It's the closest thing I can find to an academic piece on using checklists. One thing I want to mention up front from the book, Gawande talks about how people think using a checklist is beneath them. They're too smart for that. They don't need it. So let me offer this. Maybe you don't need a checklist on your good days at work, when you've gotten enough sleep. You have no worries occupying your mind. You have no interruptions, and you're in a great mood. But what about those days when there's a pandemic, when any and all of those things could be happening, when you could be totally off your game, and there's really not a lot you can do about it? The checklist is there for you to make you your better self every day. And then there's this book, which also discussed checklists, but from the perspective of checklists as productivity tools, which is also a way that I like to think of them. The book covers the topic from a variety of angles, from home to work. So it's interesting, but more of a self-help book, whereas the Checklist Manifesto is a little more academic, a little more research-based. But there's one topic they both cover, and that's mental fatigue. And I'm guessing we're all kind of in the state right now. The quote on the slide is from a psychotherapist and a psychiatrist, and this goes back to the use of checklists as memory tools. So the question becomes, do you want to spend your, I'll put it in air quotes, brain energy, trying to remember something simple, like the next step in a process in a system that's not intuitive, or a style for a second level heading in a document you're editing? Or do you want to let the checklist handle that? Let the checklist remember things for you, so you can use your brain energy to analyze data or to rewrite the text for a tough concept. Yeah, just glancing at the chat. So thank you for chit-chatting, I like it. So based on these two books and my years of usage of checklists, and some early informal surveys of my peers online, and in many conversations with people at conferences and through webinars like these, I'm a self-proclaimed checklist specialist. Pretty impressive, right? I joke, but I haven't been able to find much concrete research beside the two books I told you about. And I guess this is a topic begging for research, but that's another project for another day, I guess. But I'm not just a checklist specialist. I advocate for a special kind of comprehensive checklist just for your use. So this isn't something that you could, find at a book somewhere. You have to make it yourself. So I like to talk about checklists for writing and editing tasks, just the type of stuff we do, because I've experienced the benefits of a good checklist firsthand and with the team I used to manage. But I have particular requirements for good checklists, and we'll discuss them in greater depth in the rest of this session. Because I've presented this topic in different formats and I've been asked to make the connection more clear, I want to make sure I tie the reasons for using a checklist directly to the point of the talk. How do they make you more efficient? How do they make you more consistent? And my answer is that going through the process of establishing what needs to be done, task for optimal efficiency, and being able to follow a set list of items that I check off as I go has allowed me to be more efficient and more consistent in my editing, writing, and communications tasks. As an editor especially, or even as a writer who's editing yourself, the ability to be consistent in formatting and style and wording has been invaluable. but I think it's helpful for many other tasks, other types of tasks as well. The checklist keeps me on task. It allows me to stop and start back up with a lot less lack of focus and certainly less worry. It allows me to track metrics and accurately estimate future projects. It's a nice motivational tool too. You get to see your progress as you go, and if you do have good metrics, you'll be able to better estimate how much longer the task will take by where you are in the checklist. Because I have a lot to do in too little time, like many of you, because I do value quality and consistency in the materials I edit and write, like many of you, I like knowing I've done my best, and the checklist documents all of that. And thank you, Talia, for the shout out. I appreciate it. So how do you go about getting started and creating a comprehensive checklist? Here's a roadmap of what we're going to cover. The bulk of the session is going to be how do you create a comprehensive checklist for use with communication tasks at work. Though it may seem like a lot of tasks, a lot of steps, some of them are simple. You can see that already. The hard ones, well, doing the hard work in those steps is usually where you get the most benefit from the checklist. So for the right task, the benefits are more than worth the work. And I'll show samples from my own checklist throughout, so it's not just going to be me yapping. I mean, I'm going to yap the whole time, but I'm going to give you moments here and there where I'm not yapping so you can look at my checklists, tear them apart. The first step, of course, is to choose a task. Hopefully the discussion so far has got you thinking about tasks that need a good comprehensive checklist in your work life. Or maybe when you go back to work, you might think of other options. I provide some food for thought on tasks that might benefit from a comprehensive checklist on the next slide. So in my experience, tasks that are similar and repeated regularly are good candidates for a comprehensive checklist. For instance, as a medical editor, in my last full-time position, there's not enough water today, sorry. I would edit a number of standard responses, probably 5 to 10 every day. They were all similar in style and format, and even the content would be similar in those in the same therapeutic area. So it could be really hard to remember what I had done to a particular document by the end of the day. Did I check the abbreviations in this one or the last one? I also had to access documents in 4 different systems over the 8 years I worked there. And there would always be updates or changes to the processes or the systems. We'd often be asked to start checking for new things or sometimes stop checking for certain things. Documenting the steps in the checklist helped me remember the latest process and requirements and perform the steps more efficiently without second guessing myself. The checklist also documented current style and formatting details, so I could be sure that I was up to date with the latest style guides, something else that was always changing and evolving. Checking items off the checklist as I went along allowed me to start and stop an editing task without forgetting where I was and losing time duplicating my efforts. And with all the different projects we all have, tracking metrics for your tasks, whether you do it for yourself or because you have to, is much easier if you do it on your checklist. But sometimes tasks that are not done frequently are good candidates as well. How do you remember how to do something you only do twice a year or every quarter if it has a lot of steps or the system you do it in is not intuitive and doesn't walk you through it? These types of tasks might also be good candidates for a checklist, especially if the process is not currently documented. I'm sure we've all run into situations like that. And yes, Laura, I do use Perfect It. And I put on my checklist, run Perfect It right at the beginning. Just like I put things like, so I put everything in there. The second step is easy. If you wanted to, you could open up a new Word document. But if the task is also on the computer, which is practically given in the group, I find it easier to write it down with pen and paper. I find that if you're creating the checklist on the computer as you do the task, you tend to get distracted and work on the checklist format or edit what you're putting there. And that's not the point at this time. You really just want to get it all down. So this third step is where you start doing the task, writing down everything you do when you do this task, whether it's editing a document, writing a document, putting together a social media post, whatever kind of research task you have that has certain steps you have to do. But just get it down rough, like brainstorming, without editing yourself. Just get it all down on paper. So some advice for this. I know it's hard in this day and age. We all have too little time, too much to do, but don't do this part in a rush. Be patient and give yourself time to write everything down. And don't assume everything. So have you ever gone on a really great vacation where you totally unplugged and did not think about work? You came back from work, you came back to work with a clear head and tried to log in and had no idea your password. I love those vacations. So what if you went on one of those vacations and got back to your desk and your brain was empty? What would prompt you to remember what needs to be done with the task? Write it down at that level. Don't skip steps now. If you decide you don't need them later, you can edit them out during testing. But for now, just write it all down. This is also a good exercise for appreciating just how much you do without thinking about it. Not just anyone can do what you do. And if you ever had to train someone to do something that you do, you know this. There's so many things that you just do automatically. So even if you don't think you want to use checklists, even if you just use this exercise to figure out how hard something is that you do, it might make you feel good about yourself. So related to the third step is the fourth step. Write down every step you take in performing a task. So keep in mind that writing down all the steps is where you get the productivity benefits of a checklist. Anyone ever get interrupted in the middle of a task? Right? Or have to go to a meeting in the middle of something? But if you did, you had it marked in the checklist where you stopped, then you know where to start back up again without having to think about where you were. I mean, what happens when you're on a big project and you have to go off to a meeting and then it's the end of the day and you leave and then you come back the next day and you're all meetings and you try to go back and you're like, what was I doing? A checklist could help you remember where you were and get you right back into the flow of your document. Have you ever started doing something to a document like checking the headings or finding an abbreviation that's often spelled wrong, then realized, wait, I already did this. Again, this is where the checklist helps. Are there items you'll forget, or that you're afraid you'll forget, or that you have forgotten in the past when doing a task? Write it down. The checklist is there for you. But keep in mind, this is not a one and done. Sure, you can brainstorm what needs to be done for a particular task, but don't call that a checklist. At least don't call that a checklist specialist checklist. There's still work to be done. So the fifth step is where you take the steps from your handwritten notes and put them all together into a real document. I use Word, but use whatever makes sense for you. At this point, I wouldn't edit it. You just put it all in. You take out stuff when you test it. And you should definitely test it. What did I say in the last slide? Don't throw it all on the page and call it a checklist. When you do create a format for it, though, don't forget a space for check marks. I'm surprised how many people don't do that. On the next 3 slides, I show excerpts from a couple of my checklists with some more instruction on how to make checklists. And don't judge my checklists, please. These are for your own use only. You may want to put it in a more attractive format. You may want to put it in a different, maybe you have an application that works for you. Like I think I've seen checklists in Trello, or you can put them in other apps if you need to. But the basic checklist has worked for me. Once you have it down and you know that it's something you're going to keep using, you can make it better. So in the sixth step, you add specifics. So forget what you've seen in editing or writing textbooks that are helping newbies learn what technical writing or editing is. And no offense to those of you who are students or just getting out of school or who are new. But I've been doing this for 20 years. So I'm a professional. I need better tools. I've seen many checklists in textbooks or checklists on websites. People take a lot of liberty with the word checklist. But for my checklist specialist, I want more for you. So what you're going to see out there might be really generic. You might see something like, check the headings. Okay, what do I check them for? I prefer to tell myself to check for specific things. So when you're working with multiple clients, you have similar types of documents, different styles, you're in a tight deadline, check the headings is not helpful. I want to see, as I've shown here, what it needs to look like. So I can quickly look at my checklist. Oh, heading level 1 should be all caps and underlined. And look at my document and go, that should be heading level 1, and that is not all caps. And I know exactly. I don't have to look it up in the style guide. I don't have to sit there for a moment, remember which client is this and whether they need it all caps or whether they need it, lowercase or whatever. So you want to notate and show what the headings should look like so you know at a glance how they should look. Otherwise, you'll get confused, and I'm telling you this from experience. Show what you want to see, say what it should be specifically. Thank you, Heather. Proposal writing, yes, is definitely a place where things, software like Perfecta and checklists would definitely be helpful, because I know I've edited a lot of proposals, and there's certain sections that you have to cover and make sure they're in there. And I'll have some examples from manuscript checklists that are probably similar to what you would have to know. So here's a snippet from a checklist that show how the tables should look in a certain type of document. In a previous position, one of the goals of the editors was to be consistent across the therapeutic areas and the writers. The editors need to make sure the documents look similar, because before we got there, every team was doing their own thing. All the documents looked different, but yet if somebody called into the call center looking for documents from the different teams and they all look different, that doesn't look good for the company. So this was an attempt to help the editors see when a table had the right formatting and coloring. All of this is spelled out in more detail and in more words in the style guide, but this is like a cheat sheet. So the editor could look at it and go, oh yeah, those look like the right colors. Because a lot of times, we were dealing with type A writers, and so a lot of them were very particular and they had everything correct. And so you just really could look at it quickly and you're like, yeah, it looks like they've got everything. Or if you had to dive deep because they did it all wrong and you had to recreate it, you would know exactly how to do it. As I mentioned, for any type of checklist, don't just assume that you remember all the steps in the process of the task or the exact style items. Write it all down. So I've struggled with social media tasks. I have an example here of a Twitter post on the slide. But if you think about the larger process of publicizing an event for a chapter, which I know some people here have had to do, something that I only do once a month for the chapter, and usually at the last minute when I've already worked my full-time job or been busy with clients all day, I need help remembering what needs to be done. It's not just what needs to be done. That can be hard to remember all that. It's the best order too. So for example, some things have to be done in a specific order. You can't finish creating the event in Eventbrite if you don't have an image. You can't include a link to the event if it's not created in Eventbrite. For other things, it helps if you do it in a specific order, like writing the LinkedIn post, which can be longer, and then stealing text from it to post to Twitter, which had shorter character limits. And speaking of character limits, how do you keep track of them? There was a time there where it seemed like they were always changing. The image requirements are changing a lot for the different platforms. You could put it all on a checklist so you don't forget. So if this is something you do for your chapter, you can create a checklist for yourself. And when you move on to a new position, as most of us do, because we're addicted to volunteering, or we go from one position to another, you can pass it on to the next person, and that will help with your training a lot. And they can use it as a basis for their own checklist. So this isn't a great checklist, but it's a better idea of some of the things that you would want to spell out on your checklist. Now the where am I? The seventh step is where you reap many of the productivity benefits of a checklist. Thinking about how you can be more efficient in performing the task. So what's the optimal order of steps? Working this out takes time, and you may have to test things a couple of different ways. But once you have it all typed into the checklist, it's easier to move things around. If you're editing documents, for instance, you want to group activities that require you to use the find function in one section. And if you're editing or writing anything, you want to have spell check at the end, which I said before. You may still rearrange things in the testing and revising steps, but do your best based on what your instinct tells you at the time. This is also helpful if you tend to get into a really messy document and your attention goes everywhere. The checklist will help you get back to doing everything that needs to be done. So here's a snippet from a checklist that shows how I moved through editing a document in Word. I start by first cleaning up spacing and formatting issues, since those aren't usually tracked. And it gives me a nice clean doc to work with no distractions. The first couple of items are big picture items that allow me to get a view of the whole document before I get down to the details in the body text. With short timelines, most editors no longer have the luxury of multiple passes with documents, so this sort of mini pass gives them a snapshot of the document before they dive into it. You can also use the elements of a good editing checklist to edit yourself when you're the writer. So think about what makes sense for what needs to be done and put it in the checklist. Good luck with that, Stacy. You do need checklists for things like that. You need checklists for a lot of things. In the 8th step, you put the specifics of processes, what you might have to do in particular systems. And this may or may not pertain to you, but it might also work for if you have to open up certain apps, if you have to log in certain ways. You know, if you're going to social media for the chapter, maybe you log in differently than if you're getting into your own personal login. This is especially important if your systems or process just changed, which, like I said, I had worked somewhere for 8 years, and we had 4 very different systems in that time. And some of them were not intuitive. Sometimes we would start some work in a new system and then not never see it again, you know, and it wouldn't be intuitive, and it was confusing. If you have to keep looking at instructions, a lot of times you can put this kind of stuff into your checklist. So someday, you know, you might take the steps back if you stick with a system and you learn the system well enough that you don't think you need to have it in the checklist. But if you need them now, put them in. You know, the checklist is there for you to use as you need. No one else has to see this checklist. This is for your productivity. This is your toolbox. It should grow and change as you do. And I just like, this is a judgment-free zone. If you need reminders, if you need instructions, then add them in. If you just save to a shared drive, you may not need this, but if you use a CCMS or a CMS, this could be helpful. If it's something you just know how to do, then you can just write perform spell check. You don't have to make steps for yourself for how to perform the spell check. But even if you know you need to perform the spell check, this is one of those things you can't afford to forget. So it still needs to go on the checklist. So here's a snippet from a checklist showing the last few steps of editing a particular type of document. These steps are mechanics that needed to be done to complete a task in the systems I worked on. Obviously, we all need to run a spell check, but then it also covers things like making sure the cross-references are updated, checking over the document one last time, like if it's in track changes, checking both with and without markup, saving it. It sounds silly, we should be saving all the time, but just in case. And some of the tasks we needed to do once we put the document in the system. At the end, I also like to add a feel-good section called Great Catch, which I used to document when I caught something important, misspelled product name, wrong data in a table, different abbreviations for one term or the same abbreviation for different terms. Those are always fun. This is a nice little place another motivational tool that you can put in your checklist. Cindy's asking for all the bullets in each item. When do you know if you should make the bullets their own checklist item? To me, it depends. Depends on how you're going to use it. It's very, to me, this is very personal. I might, you know, there might be a whole box, and I'll just check the whole box, even though there's different bullets. It depends on how long you've been doing it. So to me, like how many bullets and how many check marks, to me, that's really personal. I tend to put check marks between, next to most of the bulleted items. Here's a snippet from a checklist when I didn't have all the necessary information when I began the project. I forgot to take out the logo. Don't tell them. So after documents went through the approval process, I had to go through the documents again. And there were like 50 documents to fill in the blanks and correct a few things that had changed since we began the project, but before I posted them to SharePoint. Now, of course, if you're single sourcing like Jose, you don't have to do this kind of stuff, but I was in Word and it was not sophisticated. So this just helped me go through the different documents and see whether I'd corrected them, I'd updated them. No, that's okay, Cindy. If I haven't said this enough about how personal I think checklists are, like I'm telling you all, you should create checklists, but they're going to be very much specific to you and what you think should be in them, and how you use them is going to be specific to you. So I usually like to say at some point, I think it's towards the end, that your boss can't give you a checklist. Like it's got to be something that comes from you specifically and that you use. So in the 9th step, I recommend that you add tracking items. Now, maybe you don't think you need this. Maybe there's other systems at work that do this for you. I know there's some companies that make you track your time. But if you're not doing that in any other way, I would rather track something now and find out I need it later, or that it's nice to have, than to not have tracked and then wish I had. So I tend to default to tracking my time on things and how long documents are and what I've done with them. Start, stop times, due date, length of document. This section can be anything you need it to be, though. Again, personal. Does your boss want to know how much time you spend on a particular task? Do you need to prove that something that seems easy, oh, you could just whip that out, right? It's actually more complicated and time-consuming than it looks, probably because you do it well, you do it in a professional way instead of just throw it together. For editing tasks, are there certain authors, teams, or topics that take more time? Either because the work comes to you in a worse state or because it's just more complicated. So these types of things can be tracked and checklisted and summarized into reports or informal discussions with others. Usually this is more of I'd kind of glance through and be like, oh yeah, oncology is a nightmare. Oncology is really hard. There's a lot more abbreviations. It just takes me more time. Or so-and-so is not our best writer. So those take a lot longer to edit. And sometimes the managers find that helpful. You say it in a nice way, but it's a way to, when you're working really fast and, you're trying to get things done, you don't always think about it, but sometimes the checklist bubbles things up to the surface for you. Paper checklists are also a useful way for remembering what was going on with a particular task if asked about it later. So if you didn't have time to check something or do something in the checklist, you'll have a note of it with your tracking information that might, and you probably want to write down why, or maybe it will be in there. So for instance, if the tracking section said the document was a rush, the number of pages showed that it was really long, or it had the name of an author who was troublesome, you would know why that one took longer than others. If one didn't take very long at all, you could look at it and see the opposite. If the document was very short, of course it didn't take very long. So you can also use the checklist to track little details specific to a task in case there are things that cropped up that weren't on the checklist. So I find this sometimes with new therapeutic areas or products for the pharmaceutical editing I do. So I have some common terms in the checklist. There's many more in the style guide. But with a new product or indication, there may be a word I've never seen before. And if I go to the trouble of Googling it or looking it up in a medical dictionary or consulting with other documents or writers for more information or find out what's the proper way to spell it or use it, and then I run across it again, I can go back to my last checklist for that product or indication and find out what I did last time. So this helps with consistency and also just not reinventing the wheel, so to speak. So here are a couple of snippets showing tracking items and a couple of different types of checklists I used. You can see that you can be very specific and spell out whatever details are helpful to you. If you support a whole team of writers, for instance, and you need to tell your boss who's been sending you work and who is not, then a quick flip through the checklist will show you that certain writers or certain teams are sending you work. And later you can consolidate all of this manually. I used to do it monthly to get a better idea of what I was working on. And this was actually a thing. We discovered like a whole team wasn't even sending work to the editor and they were supposed to. You may not come in that situation, but maybe you'll be in a different situation, a similar one. So the first sample is part of an editing checklist, but the second is a conversion checklist. And so we had one project where we had to take old PowerPoints that had been created in an old style and converted, and then we had to convert them to a new template. So if the person or team had used a template, converting the slides to a new template was a breeze. But there were many, many more that were never based on a template or were created in the days before templates. I'm really not sure, but they were so ugly. They had this, I should show it just because it's lovely. It's like this blue jewel, kind of a shiny background, and then it would have like white and yellow text on the front, and because it wasn't a template, when you would try to change all the text, you'd lose the text on a new white background. So it was a lot of work. This is obviously just the tracking for it, but the whole rest of it would go through. It had some tips for how to do it better, and it had some, this is how it should look. It had a lot of different things to help us. It was obviously like one of these short-term projects, and there were a lot of us working on it, so we all used the checklist to make us consistent in how we were doing it. And also when we would learn things, like one person would learn, oh, if you do this, you can do this easier, and then tell the rest of us, and we put it on the checklist, and then everybody was more consistent and efficient. So that was very helpful for that little project. Sydney, yeah, it's been, it was definitely interesting. They were really ugly. Yeah, Cody, I know a lot of companies do have tracking software, but it's helpful to track things and have things tracked yourself and be able to look back at what happened with a certain document. Here are a couple of recent ones. You'll see my run perfected on the one of them. The first one, do I know how to do the items in the first one? Yeah, of course. It's very short. It's for a one-page document, but I do them fairly frequently for someone. And then I invoice after a set number of them. So the sheet has 3 of these pictures. It helps me quickly see how long they've each taken me instead of assuming, how long it takes. And it reminds me when I have more than one of them at a time to do all the steps to all of them, because sometimes they send them in packs and sometimes they just send one. And the second one, you can see a few different helpful things. One, it reminds me to run perfect at the beginning of the project, since I sometimes forget and try to run it at the end. It's more helpful at the beginning, even though sometimes I do also run it at the end. But at the beginning, it helps with the abbreviations. It gets me an idea of what the document has in it already. Second, these are areas, types of documents that have word counts. And it's helpful to we have somewhere to write it down, like, oh, this is what the journal requires, and this is what we have. And that's important because if you have too many words, the journal automatically rejects it. So here I write down the requirements and then see where we are. And then here, this is the manuscript one that I was talking about, Heather, where it's got certain sections. Make sure it has the following sections. And the abstract, make sure it has the following sections and the main text. I know they're very different sections of proposals, but this kind of, make sure all the different sections are in there. And if they're not in there, you might put a note next to it why. Or sometimes what I find is the journal's not specific. It doesn't have to say methodologies. It could say methods, and I might mark it on there like that so that I remember how this one was different. And the last sequence of steps. This is where you figure out what really works and what doesn't. I will admit, full disclosure, I've put together a checklist that I didn't ultimately end up using. I never had to do the task again. The checklist wasn't as helpful as I thought it would be to have a checklist. But I find that you're much more likely to have the opposite effect of wondering how in the world you ever did without your checklist if you do create a checklist and it turns out to be really helpful to you. So just as an aside, I do try to be green in most areas of my life. I think we're all really green right now. Nobody's driving anywhere, nobody's doing anything. But when it comes to checklists, as I mentioned, I prefer paper. One reason is because I prefer the physical act of checking something off a paper checklist, which is nice, motivational kind of thing. And some people, especially if they have multiple monitors, they might be more comfortable with an electronic checklist. But I find it easier to write small notes on paper. It also gives your eyes a momentary break from staring at the screen. So I like paper checklists. In the sequence of steps, you want to get it all down on paper, rearrange it until it makes sense, then test it with a real task and edit it as you go. So when you're done with the task, update the checklist, print it out, test it again. You're not stuck with the original sequence of steps. Try something new if some of the steps don't seem to be flowing. Test it, update it, test it again. I think somebody said a little further up in the chat that your checklist would probably change as you learn something. Stacy, yeah. The checklist will change with you over time, and it's true, it totally does. And that's okay, that's great. So how do you know when you have good checklists? The title of my talk doesn't mention peace of mind, but picking up where you left off with confidence is sometimes priceless, especially in this day and age. There are always interruptions, there's always distractions. You're definitely going to have an off day. I'm an experienced professional. I know what to do when I get a project for the most part. But as an experienced professional who's good at what I do, like many of you, I also end up with a lot of projects. So in my last full-time position, I had many different types of projects, different clients, different systems, different types of work. Having a checklist for many of the tasks helped me keep them all straight and know where I am with any of them at any one time. Have you ever had a project or document drag on until you were sick of it? You just want it off your plate, but it's really important. How do you know if you've done enough? Sometimes a checklist can help you know you've done enough that it's ready to move off your plate. And sometimes that can be really, that can be really helpful to you if you've really gotten to the point where you're so sick of the document that you're not even sure if your judgment is just, if your judgment is good about whether it's done or whether you're just sick of it. So some other instances when you know you have a good checklist. The first one's happened to me more times than I care to mention. You get caught up in a messy document and there's so much to do, there's so much to fix that you forget to check something. Sometimes it's something small and you might catch it if you end up looking at the document at another time. But sometimes it's important, like misspelling the product name or having a heading that has typo in it. You know, something that people are really definitely going to notice. The second one has happened, and other people have caught it for me because I was not using a checklist and I was just shooting from the hip. See how that goes when you're usually so on top of it with your checklist, and then you have things where you don't have a checklist and you're not so on top of it anymore. So as I'm growing my freelance business, the metrics have become really important. I have the metrics from when I edited certain types of documents for multiple clients where I used to work. And now I'm gathering them for new clients who want to know, well, how much is this going to cost me? How long will this take? And sometimes it can be hard. You get real deep into a document or a project and time flies and you don't know how long it's taking. But if you have it in your checklist, you know. So let's go over some things to remember as you go out in the world to create your comprehensive checklists. First of all, these checklists are for you to use. So I can't tell you what they should look like, and your boss shouldn't be creating them for you. You need to create them for you. For teams, you can create one for the team. There's a task you all do, and you need to be consistent in how you do it. And I did have checklists for common tasks when I managed a team of editors. But you have to work on the checklist together, so they work for all of you. You'll also find that you'll learn things from each other, which is nice as well. But a checklist shouldn't be punitive. It shouldn't be a necessary evil. It's a tool in your toolbox to do your job better with less strife and more peace of mind. And not your boss's peace of mind, your peace of mind, because you're a professional and you want to do things well. Secondly, you should be updating your checklist and changing them as your job or the task changes. Unless, of course, your work never changes. But I don't know anybody who's been able to do the same job the same way for many years. There's always a new system or a new task, or you learn that you were doing something wrong that you want to correct. There's always change. Generally, you can create checklists for editing tasks, which is what I was using them for initially and where I have a lot of experience with them. But you can use them for writing tasks or social media work, research projects, business tasks. Now that I use them for my own business, I use more business tasks. I have a Financial Friday checklist that just has me check in with, what's in the bank accounts, what's coming up for bills, who have I invoiced, who still needs to be invoiced, what's outstanding, do I need to follow up with anybody? Any type of repeated task is a good candidate for a checklist. I'm sure there's many tasks that I haven't even touched upon because I don't have experience, like Heather was saying, proposals are really good to have checklists. But it seems like, web work, publications work. I'm sure the group can help me think of other options in the discussion at the end. And I certainly welcome your suggestions. So I've got the resources listed here, and I can provide my slides as we were saying. Of course, this is being recorded, so you could certainly listen to it again if you dared. Now we do have a couple minutes to talk, if anybody has any other questions that I haven't already answered.
I believe you've seen all the ones in the chat. Does anyone have any new ones?
Hi, this is Heather. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate this, and I'm glad that you mentioned social media in particular. I just finished a copy editing class with the journalism department, and I realized that we talk about web headlines are different than newspaper headlines, and and in word count and sort of what are the characteristics.
Right.
And so this is perfect for that. And yeah, so I think I'll talk to my journalism teacher about that. So
that's great.
Yeah, so I'd love to just create a checklist just for that, and talk to the school paper. And so that'll be my pro bono project for the semester. What's left?
That's great. I love when people have takeaways.
All right, thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you. Allison asks how I store my checklists. I've actually, usually they're just in a file folder somewhere, but OneNote's not a bad idea. I started doing these before OneNote came out, so I could think about putting them in OneNote and using them from there. If you didn't want paper ones, that might be a good way to do it. Thank you.
This is Erica. I'm doing a lot of documentation, agile processes and TFS, and I've ended up starting to use tasks as kind of a checklist of the different additions, changes, etc. to the documentation that's necessary.
Nice.
If I tie it to the initial PBI, then I've got a list of what I need to do, and it's a good way for me to check it off and show everybody that, yes, I've indeed done it.
That's great. I love it. And I just put my contact information up here. You know, feel free to ask questions. Tell me about your experience with checklists. Swap checklists with me. I won't share anybody else's unless I have permission. I just like to look at them. I love to talk about checklists. So, and I can provide the slides. I also have another handout that I've given out in the past that's like an infographic that goes through all these steps. And I can provide that, and we can have them all sent out to everybody.